Well, that song and Kathy made it easy for me. I'm just going to say ditto. Amen. No, we're going to be in, we're moving through, we're going to be in Mark chapter 15. And we're going to start at verse 33. So go ahead and open your Bibles, have you access to the Word of God. To kind of recap where we're at, we learned last week about Jesus' trial and them putting an innocent man to death, essentially. And we move in, we kind of skip over some of the horrible things that happened to Jesus. Being mocked, being beaten, having to pack the cross up to the place where he was going to be nailed to it. And we kind of move into right where things kind of start to happen for our benefit. So let's start at verse 33. And when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of them that stood by, when they heard it, said, Behold, he is called Elias. And in your Bible it probably says Elijah. And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink, saying, Let alone, let us see whether Elias will come to take him down. And Jesus cried with a loud voice, and gave up the ghost. And the veil of the temple was rent in twain, from top to the bottom. And when the centurion, which stood over against him, saw that he so cried out, and gave up the ghost, he said, Truly, this man was the Son of God. So when Al talked to me about potentially preaching this week, I had already kind of started this verse anyways from a couple weeks ago when there was a potential that I was going to talk. And so you can talk about all the miracles that happened throughout the day, and it just truly was a blessing that here I was asked to preach, and we fell right on the section I had been planning a week and a half, 2 weeks prior. So it was kind of neat, and I was excited because I've got most of it done already in this section. Man, Jesus did all the work in this section. And then as I thought about it, listening to that song, I'm like, man, I really hope I don't miss this section. This is very important. So we start here, you got to kind of understand a little bit, and I don't want to make this into too much of a Bible study, but I think you have to understand what's going on here and what happened a long, long time before this. So at the 6th hour came, the way that they told time back then on these hours, the 6th hour would have been high noon, and the 9th hour would have been 3 o'clock. So this is the point of day that is the brightest. The sun is in the sky. And keep in mind this is Passover, so there's a full moon as well. So for the sky to go darkness at this time, some people would say, oh, a sandstorm came up, or oh, there was an eclipse. Those were impossible, especially the eclipse when you have the full moon. It was just impossible to happen. This was a miracle of God. And this wasn't the first time that God had done this. If you go back to the Old Testament, when God had told Moses to get our people out of Egypt, he enacted some plagues. And the second to last plague was 3 days of darkness. Here you have 3 hours of darkness. What was the plague after the 3 days of darkness? The death of the firstborn. Here you have Jesus on the cross, death of God's firstborn, an only son. A long time ago, I was told that the way to truly understand the Bible is to see Jesus on every page. And this is particularly true when you're reading the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is hard to read, especially if you haven't read the Bible a lot. But if you can focus on what you're reading and find Jesus on every page, it'll make so much more sense because he's there. The prophets before and the people of the Bible before talked about Jesus through the whole thing. You just have to recognize it. And we're going to get a little later part in. I'll tell you an aha moment for me as we went down there. So when I go back to relating the New Testament to the Old Testament, the first thing Al ever told me when I was going to preach almost a year ago to the day, it's a couple weeks ahead, he said, well, you may want to hold off on relating the Old T to the New T because it's very easy to mess that up, and that is very true. But at this part, I think I'm pretty sound in the doctrine here, what I'm going to talk about. But There was a lot of foreshadowing to Jesus on the cross, and one of those foreshadowings was Abraham and Isaac. So if you've read the Old Testament, you know that God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. He led him up on the mountain. Isaac had to carry the wood on his back that he was going to be sacrificed on to the top. You fast forward to where we're at here, just the section before, and you have Jesus walking up onto the mount with the wood on his back that he was going to be sacrificed on. God taking him there to do it, the Father. So it's very easy to find him on every page. Just kind of look, and you'll see him there. The next verse, verse 34, says, "At the 9th hour," which is again at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" That is probably one of the most quoted verses in the Bible, and probably one of the most powerful in the Bible. So you have two things going on here. One, you have Jesus up on the cross, and that, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" That is the first line of Psalms 22. So you have Jesus quoting Psalms 22 up on the cross. Now, why would Jesus do that? Well, you have a lot of Jewish people standing around him. A lot of Jewish people that didn't believe in him. And I don't know if you've read Psalms 22, but we're going to cover some parts here real quick that you will see the exact correlation and why Jesus would bring this up while he's on the cross. So Psalms 22, verse 1 says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and am not silent. And I'm going to jump around. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you. But we go down to here at verse 13. They gaped upon me with their mouths as ravening and roaring lions. So around Jesus on the cross were a bunch of people, these same people that were screaming to crucify him, that we learned last week. They're out there still taunting him where he's at. You have Roman soldiers still taunting him where he's at. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. In a different gospel, you will, or a different chapter, you'll know at the end, when they checked to see if he was alive, they pierced his side and water poured out, right from this verse here. My bones are out of joint. As you're being crucified and hanging there, it was not uncommon for your shoulders to be dislocated. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death. At one point on the cross, Jesus said, I thirst. His tongue was sticking to his mouth. For the dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Now that could be more obvious at all than anything else. Surrounded by these people with his hands and feet pierced. I may tell all my bones, they look and stare upon me. What the Romans would do to kind of speed up the crucifixion is they would break the legs of the people who were on the cross. This didn't happen to Jesus. Jesus didn't have a single broken bone in his body, and that's where that comes from. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. This is actually in several different books in the OT, the casting the lots for Jesus' clothes. This happened with the Romans right down below him. So you have to understand Jesus' mentality. All these Jewish people are seeing this done, and he's quoting Psalms 22 to say, listen, I am the Messiah. David spoke of me years and years and years before the prophets have spoken of me. The second part that was happening at this point, and this is the one where that song and what Kathy had mentioned up there, this one should really hit home for us. So 3 hours of darkness during this time is when Jesus was taking in all the sin of everyone, past, present, future. A year ago, Sandra showed Riker and I a little video that kind of put this part in perspective for a youth, and it was a little cartoon, and it had Jesus up on the cross, and all these black dots were coming on him until it completely encompassed him. Now, this is a painful situation I could only imagine for both for God and for Jesus. He's bearing our sin. Now, why would he do this? There was 10,000 angels waiting to get him taken off the cross. And he would not allow it to happen. And it's because he loved us so much.
Amen.
That line, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? You have to understand what the word forsaken means. If you look it up, it means abandoned, deserted. Why would Jesus feel this way? Well, at this point, there was so much sin happening in this time period that God had to turn his back because he could not look upon the sin. This is the first time in Jesus' life that one, he's sinned, taken the sin, and two, that God has not been there with him. Now, I can tell you, with that being done, God has promised that he will never do that to us because of what Jesus did on the cross.
Amen.
This was for us. Now, I can only kind of relate this. I was trying to figure out how I could relate this. This is a pretty corny story, but I think if you look at it this way, you would understand kind of what Jesus is feeling. So let's say you're walking with your father out in the desert, and you slip and fall into some quicksand. And as you're sinking up on the quicksand, your father's watching you. And just before you're about to go under, you reach your hand up for your father to pull you out, and your father turns his back on you. That's what Jesus was feeling at that point. It's very, very powerful. Now, let's flip it into God's perspective. No father likes to see their son, their daughter, their kids in pain. And I actually experienced this even a little more this week. As most of you know, Riker was admitted into the hospital there, and I can tell you, and I know I don't have to tell you because anyone with kids in here knows, the hardest thing to do is to watch your child in pain and know that there's nothing you can do for it but pray. And again, I just broke one of Al's rules where I said there's nothing you can do but pray. That should be the first thing that you do. And that's what we were doing at the time.
We were.
And I'll tell you what, the power of prayer is amazing. Because at that point in time, we were told we were going to be doing a life flight for a appendectomy surgery. And after lots of prayer, it turned out just a simple flu. So God works in mysterious ways. Let's jump to 37. And Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. Now, this is kind of a shortened version of what happened. As you read all the chapters, you start to learn everything that Jesus said on the cross. Jesus spoke 7 times on the cross. Now, one of the things that he said in this particular time was tetelestai, which means it is finished. And as you look at that, when you read this verse, you can basically say, it is finished, and he gave up the ghost. Which I remember being a kid, watching old movies, and they talk about gave up the ghost. I had no idea what that ever meant. But it came from right here. So Jesus died after he said this. Now, that it is finished could be interpreted as Jesus said, I'm done, and died. It's over. But as Kathy mentioned, that isn't even close to what he was saying. See, before this, the only way to get rid of sin was to shed the blood. The blood had to be shed on the altar. You had to sacrifice a perfect ram, a perfect lamb for all your sin. And it had to be done in a certain way. And the blood was shed and splattered. This changed everything. Yes. Jesus saying it is finished changed all of that. Now, let's talk about crucifixion for a second here. Crucifixion, I don't know if the Romans invented it, but they were definitely the ones that used it the most. And it was the most heinous way to execute somebody at the time. It was so bad that the Romans would not allow other Romans to be crucified. This was reserved for their enemies. So, as you're crucified, it is a slow asphyxiation death. So you basically are running out of air over a period of time, and there is nothing you can do about it. For Jesus to even speak, he would have to push down on the nails in his hands and in his feet to lift him up a little bit to get enough air in his lungs to even speak. Now, I don't know about you, but I got a sliver the other day at work, and I was trying to figure out where it was, and I was rubbing my finger, and I hit that little sliver, and you'd have thought I cut my arm off, the pain that shot down.
Yeah.
right? Imagine nails in your legs and your hands and doing that to say what you needed to say. Excruciating pain. Now, the other form of tetelestai, it means it is finished, but it's a little more in depth than that. So back in this time, when you had an invoice and you were paying a merchant and they give you the invoice back, they would write tetelestai on it, and it means paid in full. And that's very important to understand, because the first part of taking Jesus into your heart is to admit that you're a sinner. Is to admit that you need help with sin. And if you understand this part, if you understand what Jesus went through, that your sin is paid in full, it's just so much more meaningful of what he did up on the cross for us. Paid in full. You don't have to worry about the sin that you do, because it is paid in full. You just have to make the promise to try to do it less. Jesus has done this for us. It's up to us to strive for the righteousness and pay him back. Verse 38, and the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. So this is very important, because what you had in the temple was a section where God's presence was, the Holy of Holies. And there was a veil in front of it, and nobody was allowed in it but one priest each year. And they would actually tie a rope around this priest so that if he went into this and was struck down by God, that they could drag him out. That veil was basically saying, this is the only way to access God. You can only access God through us, right here. By that veil going down the middle and ripping, God was saying, no more. Jesus paid it in full. You can access God anytime that you want to access God, because Jesus is our mediator.
Amen.
You don't need a priest. You don't need a temple. You don't need a veil. You need to talk to God. You down on your knees and you pray and you talk to God. Amen. And if you listen with an open heart, God will talk back. All because of what Jesus did on that cross for us. Now this last verse, and when the centurion, which stood over against him, saw that he cried out and gave up the ghost, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. So there was a few other things that happened at this time, and one of them was a great earthquake that happened at the same time that that veil was tearing. And the reason that I talk about this part is because you have a centurion, which is a Roman soldier, a high Roman soldier. It means he has 100 people under him, standing there and admitting that Jesus was the Son of God. There are Jewish people right in front of him who still haven't admitted that, and still didn't want to admit that. And the goal of Mark's gospel is so that you understand that very point, that Jesus is the Son of God. And now, I took a little offense to this when I read it, when he says, Jesus, this true man truly was the Son of God. But at the time, you have to understand that the centurion, this man was dead. We know now that he's not.
Amen.
And we'll talk about that next week. But for the centurion to say that in front of the Jewish people and other Romans, he was actually putting his life at risk for saying it. He was just so compelled at what he saw and what happened and what Jesus did on the cross, that truly he's the Son of God. Now, I only planned on talking about that verse 39, but I want you to look at verse 40, because it does strike me as very important. There were also women looking on afar off, among whom was Mary of Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James, and Les, and Joseph, and Salome. At this point in Jesus' life, he has just now died, and around him was majority enemies watching this for what he had just done for us. But there were a few in the crowd, John being one, and then these women of the Bible. Now, men, you can probably admit to me, and I know I wouldn't be right here at this very point if it wasn't for my wife. But the women of God are so important. They were so important in Jesus' life, and they're so important in our life. You think about it. There were 12 disciples. One of them no longer with them. So 11 disciples that said we would never turn our back on you, we would never walk away. One was there. But these women of the Bible were there to support Jesus. Now at this time is where I usually tell you, if you were to walk out that door and something should happen, your heart should stop beating, do you know what would happen to you? Do you know where you would go? But I come across a story that says that a little bit better, and it actually talks about what I struggled with before I was saved. And it's about the devil and his men. See, the devil sat around and he was coming up, he wanted to challenge his demons. He was tired of losing people, and the devil, I'll tell you, the devil truly understands retail, because it's easier to keep a customer than it is to go get a new one, and the devil understands that more than anybody. The devil will fight you the minute he knows he's going to lose you. So he is having this conference, and he says, how can we stop this from happening? And one of the demons raises his hand and he says, I know what we'll do. We'll go to earth and I'll convince the people that God does not exist. And the devil said, no, that ain't going to work. You see, they can walk outside and they can see the sky and the stars and the trees and the dirt and the grass and the miracles that happen every day. And they know that God exists. So he puts his head down, and another demon raises his hand. He said, I'll go to earth and I'll convince them that hell isn't real. And the devil says, I don't think that's going to work either. You see, they're smart enough to know that there's consequences for their actions. And he hung his head, knowing that there was nothing that they could do. And a third demon raised his hand, and he said, I'm going to go to earth, and I'm going to tell them that they have all the time in the world. And the devil lifted up his head, and a smile went across his face, and he said, go do it. You see, the devil will tell you that you have all the time in the world to make that decision to follow Christ. But I can tell you there's only one person, the same person that knows how many hairs are on your head is the only one that knows how many days that you have. Now is the time for salvation. 2 Corinthians 6:2 says, in an acceptable time I have heard you, and in the day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the accepted time, and behold, now is the day of salvation. Don't put it off. Make today the day. And if you have any questions about that, if you don't know what that means, if you don't know where you're at in this journey, if you've got this conviction that's just picking at you and you don't know why, come see me, come see Al, come see Sandra, come see Kathy, and we'll talk with that about you. We'll talk with it through you. Here, we're going to have Al move to the back in a minute for our final song. And if you need to speak with him about anything, don't hesitate. I'll be up front if you want to come talk to me. Let's pray real quick. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this message, Lord, and most of all, we thank you for what you did on the cross. Lord, we know that we are all sinners, and that we battle with that every day. And Lord, we know that through the help, through you, what you did on the cross for us and what you do for us every day, Lord, that we can overcome that. Lord, I just ask that you bless everybody in this room, Lord. The time they've taken out to come today. For those that don't know Jesus, Lord, I ask that you compel them to come talk to somebody about that. For today is the day of salvation. In the name of Jesus, amen. Amen.